October 3rd, 1942. The mud in Tunisia stretched endlessly beneath a scorching North African sun. Dust devils spun across the horizon like ghostly dancers, and somewhere near the edge of a supply depot outside Kasserine, a makeshift convoy prepared for what seemed like an impossible task. 5 trucks sat loaded with ammunition. 3 half-tracks carried wounded soldiers. And at the front of the line, looking completely out of place among the heavy military hardware, sat what appeared to be nothing more than a glorified farm cart welded to a set of wheels. Private Eddie Kowalski wiped sweat from his forehead as he climbed into the driver's seat of his creation. The other men called it the Tin Can Special. Some laughed and said it looked like a refugee from a junkyard. Others wondered why anyone would trust their lives to something that appeared to be held together with prayer and baling wire. But Eddie knew something they didn't. He knew that sometimes the best solutions come not from manuals or regulations, but from understanding exactly what a machine needs to do and building it to do just that. The convoy had been stuck for 3 days. A German artillery barrage had cratered the main supply road, leaving a gap too wide for standard vehicles to cross. Worse yet, a disabled Sherman tank sat stranded on the far side of the crater, its crew trapped and running low on water. Command had written it off as a total loss. The engineers said it would take a week to build a proper bridge. But Eddie Kowalski had a different idea. Who was Eddie Kowalski? Before the war, before the desert, before the machine that would make him a legend among mechanics from Tunis to Sicily, there was Edward Stanley Kowalski. He was born in the winter of 1919 in a Polish neighborhood on the south side of Chicago. His father, Stefan, worked the blast furnaces at the steel mill. His mother, Anna, cleaned offices downtown. Life was hard, but it was honest work that built character one shift at a time. Eddie grew up surrounded by noise, the clang of hammers on metal, the hiss of steam from the foundries, the rumble of freight trains carrying steel beams across the Midwest. But while other kids played stickball in the alleys, Eddie was drawn to the mechanical side of everything around him. By age 10, he could strip down a bicycle and rebuild it blindfolded. By 14, he was fixing neighbors' washing machines for pocket change. The Kowalski family didn't have much money, but they had something more valuable. They had resourcefulness. When the radiator in their old Ford cracked during a harsh winter, Eddie fashioned a temporary repair using copper tubing from a broken icebox and rubber gaskets from worn-out mason jars. When the family radio died, he rebuilt the entire circuit board using parts salvaged from discarded appliances he found behind the Sears store. His teachers noticed his talent early. Eddie had a mind that could see how things worked before they were even built. He could look at a broken engine and know exactly which gear was stripped, which belt had snapped, which connection had come loose. But more than that, he could imagine improvements. He saw not just what was, but what could be. When Eddie graduated from high school in 1937, jobs were still scarce from the lingering effects of the Depression. The steel mills were running skeleton crews. The auto plants had waiting lists months long. But Eddie didn't wait for someone to hire him. He started his own operation in the family's cramped garage, fixing anything with moving parts. Radios, washing machines, lawnmowers, even baby carriages with squeaky wheels. Word spread through the neighborhood. Eddie Kowalski could fix anything. He didn't just repair things, he improved them. He made them run smoother, last longer, work better than they had when they were new. People brought him contraptions that other mechanics had declared hopeless, and somehow Eddie would find a way to bring them back to life. But Eddie was more than just a gifted mechanic. He was an innovator. When Mrs. Kowalski from the apartment upstairs complained that her sewing machine kept jamming, Eddie didn't just oil the mechanism. He redesigned the thread tension system using springs from an old mattress and ball bearings from worn-out roller skates. The machine ran so smoothly that other seamstresses in the building started asking him to work on theirs. When the local ice cream vendor's cart broke down during the summer of 1940, Eddie built him a new one from scratch. But this wasn't just any cart. Eddie had studied the vendor's route, timed his stops, calculated the weight distribution needed for the steep hills in the neighborhood. The new cart was lighter, more maneuverable, and could carry twice as much ice cream without losing any to melting. Sales doubled within a month. By the time Pearl Harbor was attacked in December 1941, Eddie had established himself as the neighborhood's go-to problem solver. He could build, fix, or improve almost anything. But war changed everything. The steel mills went to full production overnight. Every able-bodied man was needed either in the factories or in uniform. Eddie chose the uniform. He enlisted in the Army Corps of Engineers, figuring his mechanical skills would be useful. The recruiter took one look at his background and nodded approvingly. The Army needed men who understood machines, men who could keep the war machine running when it broke down thousands of miles from the nearest supply depot. Eddie's basic training was at Fort Belvoir in Virginia. While other recruits struggled with the technical aspects of military engineering, Eddie absorbed everything like a sponge. Bridge construction, demolitions, vehicle maintenance, field repairs under combat conditions. But what set him apart wasn't just his ability to follow procedures. It was his instinct for finding solutions that weren't in any manual. During one training exercise, Eddie's unit was tasked with moving a disabled artillery piece across a muddy field. The standard procedure required a heavy recovery vehicle that wasn't available. Other teams struggled for hours trying to drag the gun with ropes and pulleys. Eddie studied the problem for 10 minutes, then disappeared into the motor pool. He returned with what looked like a collection of spare parts. Axles from damaged trucks, wheels from different vehicles, steel plates from construction equipment. Working through the night, he assembled something that resembled a cross between a sled and a trailer. It wasn't pretty, but when morning came, Eddie's contraption moved that artillery piece across the field in half the time it took the other units using conventional methods. His instructors were impressed, but they were also puzzled. Eddie's solution worked perfectly, but it didn't match anything in their field manuals. One sergeant pulled him aside and asked where he had learned to build such a device. Eddie shrugged and said he hadn't learned it anywhere. He had just looked at what needed to be done and figured out how to do it. That answer would become Eddie's trademark throughout the war. He didn't rely on textbooks or regulations. He relied on understanding the problem and using whatever materials were available to solve it. In a military culture built on standardization and procedure, Eddie Kowalski was an anomaly. He was a mechanic who thought like an inventor, and an inventor who understood that in war, the best solution is usually the simplest one. By the time his unit shipped out to North Africa in September 1942, Eddie had already gained a reputation among his fellow engineers. He was the guy you went to when the standard equipment wouldn't work, when the supply lines were cut, when you needed something built from nothing but scrap metal and imagination. But North Africa would test him like nothing he had ever faced before. The desert was a machine killer. Sand got into everything. Heat warped metal. Cold nights cracked engine blocks. And somewhere in the wasteland between Tunisia and Algeria, Eddie Kowalski would build something that would change how the army thought about mobility, ingenuity, and the power of refusing to accept that something couldn't be done. The mockery was about to begin. The laughter started before Eddie even finished welding the last joint. October 1st, 1942, just 2 days before the convoy mission that would change everything. Eddie knelt in the scorching sand behind the motor pool, surrounded by what looked like the scattered remains of a dozen different vehicles. Truck axles, jeep wheels, tank treads, even pieces of aircraft landing gear. To anyone watching, it appeared to be nothing more than an organized junkyard. Staff Sergeant Mike Romano walked over, shaking his head. Kowalski, what's name are you building now? Eddie wiped grease from his hands with a dirty rag and gestured toward his creation. It was low to the ground, barely 3 feet high. The frame was welded steel, painted olive drab but already showing rust spots from the desert humidity. 4 oversized wheels, mismatched but functional. A driver's seat that looked like it had been salvaged from a tractor and mounted in the rear, a winch system that defied easy description. It's a recovery vehicle, Eddie said simply. Romano laughed, the sound echoing off the nearby supply tents. Recovery vehicle? Kid, that thing looks like it was put together by a blind man in the dark. Other mechanics gathered around, drawn by Romano's laughter. They saw Eddie's contraption and joined in the mockery. Someone called it a mechanical abortion. Another said it looked like a jeep that had been run over by a steamroller. The criticism wasn't entirely unfair. Eddie's vehicle didn't look like anything that had ever rolled off a production line. The proportions were wrong. The components didn't match. The overall appearance suggested something cobbled together from spare parts, which was exactly what it was. But Eddie had built it with purpose, not appearance in mind. Lieutenant Harrison, the motor pool officer, approached with a clipboard tucked under his arm. He was a West Point graduate, 24 years old, and a firm believer in doing things by the book. Private Kowalski, is this vehicle regulation? Eddie straightened up, knowing where this conversation was headed. No, sir. It's not in any manual I've seen. Harrison nodded grimly. Then why are you building it? Eddie had prepared for this question. He gestured toward the crater that had blocked the supply road for 3 days. Sir, we've got a Sherman tank stranded on the far side of that hole. Standard recovery vehicles can't cross the gap. The ground's too soft for heavy equipment. But something light, Something with the right power-to-weight ratio might be able to make it across and pull that tank to safety. Harrison studied Eddie's creation with skeptical eyes. The frame looked flimsy compared to standard military hardware. The engine, salvaged from a damaged truck, seemed too small for serious recovery work. The winch system, while ingenious, appeared to be held together with improvised brackets and repurposed cables. Private, this looks like something you'd find rusting in a farmer's back 40. The other SL mechanics laughed again. Romano apped his knee. Farmer's back 40, that's perfect. Hey, Kowalski, you planning to plow some fields with that thing? Eddie didn't respond to the jokes. He had heard worse growing up in Chicago. Instead, he focused on explaining the engineering behind his design to Lieutenant Harrison. Sir, the weight distribution is calculated for soft terrain. The wheel spacing provides maximum stability while keeping the center of gravity low. The engine's been modified to produce more torque at lower RPMs, which is what you need for heavy pulling. And the winch system can generate 12,000 pounds of pulling force, which should be enough to move a disabled Sherman. Harrison wasn't convinced. Private, even if your contraption could pull that tank, how do you propose to get across that crater? It's 15 feet wide and 8 feet deep. No vehicle we have can make that jump. Eddie smiled for the first time that morning. We're not going to jump it, sir. We're going to drive down one side and up the other. The laughter stopped. Even Romano looked puzzled. Harrison frowned. Private, the sides of that crater are nearly vertical. Nothing can drive down a slope that's steep without rolling over. Eddie walked to the edge of the crater and pointed to the walls. Sir, if you look closely, you can see that the southern wall has a natural ramp where the explosion threw dirt up against the side. It's steep, maybe 40 degrees, but not vertical. And the northern wall has a collapsed section that creates a similar ramp on the other side. Harrison squinted in the afternoon sun, studying the crater more carefully. After a long moment, he nodded slowly. I can see what you're talking about. But 40 degrees? That's still impossible for a normal vehicle. Eddie's smile widened. Good thing this isn't a normal vehicle, sir. That evening, as the sun set over the North African desert, Eddie made final adjustments to his creation. He checked the tire pressure, tested the winch mechanism, verified that all the welds were solid. The other mechanics had returned to their tents, still chuckling about Eddie's tin can special. But Eddie wasn't building it for their approval. He was building it because he had seen a problem that needed solving, and he couldn't walk away from a problem. The next morning, word spread through the camp that Private Kowalski was actually planning to attempt a rescue mission with his homemade vehicle. Soldiers gathered around the motor pool to get a look at the machine that had become the subject of so much ridicule. Most shook their heads in disbelief. Some placed bets on how far Eddie would get before his contraption broke down. Captain Williams, the company commander, arrived just as Eddie was performing his final pre-mission checks. Williams was a veteran of the Great War, a man who had seen his share of unconventional solutions in the trenches of France. He walked slowly around Eddie's vehicle, examining it from every angle. Unlike the younger officers, Williams didn't immediately dismiss what he saw. Private Kowalski, Williams said quietly. This is either the most brilliant piece of improvised engineering I've ever seen or the most dangerous. I'm not sure which. Eddie looked up from the engine compartment where he had been checking the oil level. Sir, sometimes the only difference between brilliant and dangerous is whether it works or not. William studied Eddie's face, looking for signs of recklessness or bravado. What he saw instead was calm confidence, the steady gaze of a man who had calculated the risks and decided they were acceptable. Private, if you get yourself killed trying to prove a point, I'll have your hide. But if you can actually rescue that tank crew... Williams paused, then extended his hand. Good luck, son. As Eddie climbed into the driver's seat of his creation, the gathered soldiers fell silent. The mockery had faded, replaced by something approaching respect. Not because they believed in Eddie's machine, but because they recognized the courage it took to attempt something that everyone said was impossible. The engine coughed to life with a sound that was part growl, part wheeze. Eddie engaged the transmission and felt the vehicle lurch forward. The steering was responsive, the suspension firm but not harsh. As he drove toward the crater that had stymied the entire engineering corps for 3 days, Eddie Kowalski couldn't help but think that sometimes the best way to prove the doubters wrong was simply to do what they said couldn't be done. Behind him, the convoy waited. 5 trucks loaded with ammunition. 3 half-tracks carrying wounded soldiers who needed medical attention. And somewhere on the far side of that crater, a Sherman tank crew hours until their counted the water ran out. Eddie Kowalski was about to show them all what a tin can special could do. The descent began at exactly 0800 hours. Eddie Kowalski eased his homemade vehicle to the edge of the crater and stared down into what looked like a wound carved into the earth by German artillery. The walls dropped away at angles that would challenge a mountain goat. Loose sand and shattered rock created a treacherous slope that seemed to shift with every breath of desert wind. Behind him, the entire convoy had gathered to watch. Soldiers lined the crater's rim like spectators at a deadly circus performance. Some held their breath. Others muttered prayers. A few still whispered jokes about the crazy mechanic from Chicago who thought he could drive where tanks feared to tread. Eddie shifted into his lowest gear and felt the modified engine respond with a deep, throaty rumble. The torque curve he had engineered over countless hours in the motor pool was about to face its ultimate test. He had calculated the power-to-weight ratios, studied the physics of steep-angle descents, even practiced on smaller slopes throughout the camp. But theory and practice were about to meet reality in the most unforgiving classroom on Earth. The front wheels touched the slope and immediately began to slide. Sand cascaded down the crater wall like a miniature avalanche. Eddie felt the vehicle's nose dip forward at an angle that seemed to defy gravity. For a moment it appeared that his tin can special would simply tumble end over end into the bottom of the crater, becoming another piece of wreckage in the North African wasteland. But Eddie had built more than just a vehicle. He had built a philosophy on wheels. Every component had been chosen not for appearance or regulation compliance, but for function. The wide wheelbase prevented rollover. The low center of gravity kept the machine stable even at impossible angles. The modified suspension absorbed the jarring impacts as the wheels found purchase on loose rock and compacted sand. Halfway down the crater wall, Eddie encountered his first real crisis. A section of the slope gave way beneath his rear wheels, sending a shower of debris tumbling into the crater's depths. The vehicle slew wheels sideways, its left spinning in empty air while the right side scraped against the crater wall with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. Above him, someone shouted. Eddie couldn't make out the words over the grinding of metal against stone and the laboring of his engine, but the tone was unmistakable. They thought he was finished. They expected to watch him crash and burn like so many other desperate attempts at impossible solutions. Eddie didn't panic. Panic was a luxury he couldn't afford when 3 tank crewmen were counting on him. Instead, he did what he had always done when faced with a mechanical problem. He analyzed the situation, identified the variables he could control, and made the necessary adjustments. He eased off the throttle, allowing the vehicle's weight to settle. Then he turned the wheels slightly uphill, using the crater wall as a guide rail. The screaming of metal against stone continued, but the vehicle stabilized, slowly, carefully. Eddie resumed his descent. Paint scraped away in long silver streaks. Sparks flew from contact points between steel and rock. But the frame held. The suspension absorbed the punishment. The engine maintained its steady rhythm. When the wheels finally touched the crater's bottom, Eddie allowed himself one moment of satisfaction. The first part of his plan had worked. His tin can special had accomplished what everyone said was impossible. It had driven down a near vertical slope without rolling over, breaking apart, or exploding into flames. But the real test was still ahead. On the far side of the crater, barely visible through the heat shimmer and dust, sat 30 tons of disabled Sherman tank. Its crew had been stranded for 3 days. Their radio was dead. Their water was nearly gone. And between them and safety lay a climb that would challenge everything Eddie had built into his unconventional machine. The bottom of the crater was a moonscape of twisted metal and scorched earth. German shells had not only carved the initial hole, but had continued to fall in the area, creating a maze of secondary craters, debris piles, and unstable ground. Eddie navigated carefully, feeling his way across terrain that seemed designed to trap and destroy anything foolish enough to venture into it. The heat was overwhelming. Reflected sunlight from the crater walls created an oven effect that pushed temperatures well above what any vehicle was designed to endure. Eddie's engine temperature gauge climbed steadily toward the red zone. Steam began to rise from the radiator. The modified cooling system he had cobbled together from truck parts and aircraft components was fighting a losing battle against the desert furnace. But Eddie had anticipated this problem too. Hidden beneath the driver's seat were 2 extra jugs of water, salvaged from the camp kitchen and carefully hoarded for this exact situation. Without stopping the vehicle, he reached back, grabbed one of the jugs, and poured its contents directly onto the radiator. The water hit the superheated metal with an explosive hiss that sent steam billowing into the air like a locomotive's exhaust. The temperature gauge dropped back into the acceptable range. The engine's laboring eased. Eddie's tin can special continued its journey across the crater floor, leaving a trail of steam and determination in its wake. As he approached the far wall of the crater, Eddie could finally see the Sherman tank clearly. It sat tilted at an odd angle, one track blown completely off, its main gun pointed skyward like an accusing finger. Scorch marks along its hull told the story of the artillery barrage that had disabled it. But more importantly, Eddie could see movement around the tank. The crew was still alive. 3 figures emerged from the Sherman's hatch as Eddie's vehicle approached. They were filthy, exhausted, and clearly surprised to see any rescue attempt, let alone one mounted in what appeared to be a mechanical reject from a scrapyard. The tank commander, a lieutenant with a week's worth of stubble and uniform stained with oil and sweat, waved Eddie to a stop. "Who the hell are you?" the lieutenant shouted over the sound of Eddie's engine. Eddie grinned and shouted back, "Private Kowalski, Corps of Engineers, I'm here to get you out of this hole." The lieutenant looked at Eddie's contraption with undisguised skepticism. "In that thing?" "Soldier, I appreciate the gesture, but that tin can of yours couldn't pull a radio flyer wagon, let alone a Sherman tank." Eddie climbed out of his vehicle and walked to the rear where his winch system waited. The mechanism looked even more improvised up close. Cables that had been spliced and respliced, pulleys that didn't match. A motor that had been salvaged from a construction crane and modified with parts from 3 different vehicles. But Eddie knew that appearances could be deceiving. He had tested every component, calculated every stress load, verified. "Lieutenant to every connection," Eddie said as he began unreeling the winch cable. "This tin can just drove down a 40-degree slope to get to you. Maybe it's time to stop judging by appearances and start believing in what works." The tank commander watched as Eddie secured the cable to the Sherman's tow hooks with practiced efficiency. The cable was heavier than standard issue, rated for loads that exceeded anything the Army typically moved. Eddie had sourced it from a construction company back in Chicago, trading away his own personal gear to obtain something he knew would be essential for heavy recovery work. As Eddie returned to his vehicle and engaged the winch, the lieutenant and his crew retreated to what they hoped was a safe distance. They had seen recovery attempts go wrong before. Cables snapped under stress with enough force to cut a man in half. Winches exploded when overloaded. Vehicles were pulled apart when they attempted to move loads beyond their capability. But Eddie had calculated everything. The Sherman tank weighed 30 tons, but most of that weight would be supported by its remaining track and road wheels. The winch only needed to provide enough pulling force to overcome friction and the slight uphill grade toward the crater's exit ramp. 12,000 pounds of pulling force delivered through a mechanical advantage system that multiplied the available torque. The winch motor engaged with a sound like an angry dragon. The cable grew taut, stretching under load until it sang with tension. For a moment, nothing happened. The Sherman sat motionless, 30 tons of steel refusing to budge. Eddie's engine labored, sending black smoke into the desert air. The winch motor screamed at maximum load. Then, almost imperceptibly, the Sherman began to move. Not sliding, not dragging, but rolling forward on its remaining track as Eddie's improvised recovery system overcame inertia and friction. The tank commander stared in disbelief. His crew began to cheer. And somewhere above the crater rim, the soldiers who had gathered to watch Eddie's attempt fell into stun-can special wizened silence. The tin, working. Eddie Kowalski's collection of spare parts and determination was moving a Sherman tank across terrain that had defeated every conventional solution. But the hardest part was yet to come. Getting the tank to the crater's exit ramp was only the beginning. Pulling 30 tons of armor up a near-vertical slope would require everything Eddie had built into his unconventional machine, and probably a little bit more than that. As the Sherman approached the base of the crater's northern wall, Eddie could see the faces of the convoy soldiers lined along the rim above. Their expressions had changed from mockery to amazement to something approaching awe. The farm boy from Chicago with his tin can special was about to attempt something that would either cement his reputation as a mechanical genius or provide a spectacular demonstration of the limits of improvised engineering. Eddie shifted his vehicle into its lowest gear, felt the modified transmission engage with a solid chunk of metal against metal, and began the climb that would determine whether courage and ingenuity were enough to overcome the immutable laws of physics and common sense. The climb began with a sound that nobody had ever heard before. Not the roar of a conventional engine straining against impossible odds, but something different. A mechanical symphony of mismatched parts working in perfect harmony. Eddie's modified transmission whined in first gear. The winch motor hummed under constant load. The engine, cobbled together from 3 different vehicles, settled into a rhythm that seemed almost musical. The Sherman tank, all 30 tons of it, began its ascent up the crater's northern wall. The slope was brutal, steeper than anything in the engineering manuals, steeper than common sense suggested any vehicle could manage. But Eddie had studied the physics during those long nights in the motor pool. He understood that success wouldn't come from brute force, but from the careful application of mechanical advantage, proper weight distribution, and sheer bloody-minded persistence. 20 feet up the slope, the first crisis hit. The Sherman's remaining track began to slip on the loose sand and gravel. Instead of rolling forward, it started to slide sideways, threatening to pull Eddie's vehicle off its carefully planned route. Above the crater, someone shouted a warning. Below, the tank commander held his breath. Eddie felt the lateral pull through his steering wheel, felt his own vehicle begin to drift toward disaster. But instead of fighting the slide, he did something that defied every instinct. He turned into it, using the Sherman's sideways momentum to create a zigzag pattern up the crater wall. Like a sailboat tacking against the wind, Eddie's tin can special carved a serpentine path upward, trading distance for manageable angles. The technique worked, but it came at a cost. The winch cable, under constant stress and abraded by contact with sharp rocks, began to fray. Eddie could hear individual strands snapping, each one creating a tiny musical note as metal parted under tension. He had perhaps 5 minutes before complete failure, 5 minutes to cover the remaining 40 feet of vertical climb. That's when the engine began to overheat again. The temperature gauge climbed past the red line and into territory that no cooling system was designed to handle. Steam poured from the radiator with the fury of an industrial boiler. The smell of burning oil filled Eddie's nostrils. Every mechanical instinct told him to shut down, to save the engine before it seized completely. But 30 tons of Sherman tank hung from his winch cable, and 3 American tank crewmen counted on him for their lives. Eddie reached for his second water jug and dumped its contents onto the radiator while maintaining steady pressure on the throttle. The engine coughed, sputtered, then found its rhythm again. The temperature gauge dropped just enough to keep hope alive. Eddie Kowalski never received a medal for his tin can special. But after the war, when military engineers studied impossible rescues and unconventional solutions, they always returned to that crater in Tunisia. To the farm boy from Chicago who proved that sometimes the best answer isn't found in any manual, but in the quiet confidence of someone who refuses to accept that something can't be done.